Changing Typography on the Web and Print, The Breaking of the Tyranny of Arial, by Peggy Bloomer for Book and Publishing Conference, 2013. This paper will attempt to look at the influence of websites and Web 2.0 on typographic trends. In addition, examples of the current usage and the impact of globalization in web and printing distribution and font usage will be examined, with specific examples included to support the conclusion of this examination on the expanding use of font APIs and their impact on typographic usage. Since the dominance of Microsoft Word until the introduction of the app font face CSS style, typography has been a reduction of layout to one typeface per layout, usually Arial. Increasingly, the manufacturing of type has moved from the foundry to the software company. Foundries have remained the provenance of the designer, not the general public. However, this is changing with the introduction of the new font APIs. Websites and layouts have rediscovered display fonts, serif fonts, and specialty fonts once again. Will this spawn a new generation of ransom note typography, or is something else on the typographic horizon? Since the invention of the Gutenberg press, the Type Foundry has been associated with the commercial and technological development of content distribution from books to websites. The invention of PostScript fonts in those first days of computers and desktop publishing was very similar to the original creation of movable type. Today, we as readers and viewers of many medias take it for granted that typography and fonts are an essential and changeable part of all contemporary media. But that was not always the case. Indeed, the introduction of fonts as a component of media where the content is separated from the visual aspect of the presentation was essential to the invention of printing, is now a division that we take for granted. It is no coincidence that when using a page layout program like InDesign or Quark, the user uses the metaphor of flowing the content into the containers that we establish to hold and present it. As Marshall McLuhan observed in the 1960s, a new media always contains the content of the older media as its subject. From the inception of movable type, this has been the case. The large numbers of printed lives of saints, books of the hours, and Bibles are examples of the content of the older media, illuminated manuscripts becoming the content of the newer print media at the end of the Middle Ages. The page was the design unit of these manuscripts, just as the spread is the design unit of the magazine today. Despite the fact that these illuminated manuscripts were hand reproduced by the individual scribes, this form of production had distinct conventions of lettering and composition. As McLuhan observed about a new media, borrowing the form of the older media, the earliest printed text of the late Middle Ages used these conventions until the new media developed its own convention of composition, while keeping some conventions like pagination and binding techniques, which are still employed today in book production. In fact, when Gutenberg conceptualized his first Bible, he printed the black letter text as a clear reference to the black lettering used in illuminated manuscripts, and he added the layer of illustration as a component of his design. This inclusion of this older decorative form into the new media worked against the realization of the benefits of cost and time that the new media brought to publications, and caused him legal, financial, and scheduling problems in the release of his Bible. However, the cost reduction of books quickly put books into the hands of the common man, and literacy and access to knowledge changed forever. The early websites of the late 1990s suffered from the same lack of distinct design standard crafted for the new media in a way that's similar to the first printed books. The unit of the website, the web page, was and still is often treated as though it is a printed page in many aspects. Many designers are still focused on the fixed page with the devotion to making that page appear the same across browsers and computer platforms, even though the increasing diversity of web standard support for new HTML tags and CSS rules is varied and causes increasing need for code branching or jQuery adaptations. A model for web page design that is successful and relates to the realities of multiple platforms, screen display sizes, and browsers differences is is to create a page that is not exact across all devices, browsers, and platforms, but to create a page that works on them while remaining functional and aesthetically pleasing within these variances. Although it would take time for type as a specialty commodity to evolve and move away from becoming a mechanical reproduction of the scripts and black letter forms of the medieval scribes. Slowly, a wide variation of fonts that would be created by designers and sold as a product emerges and flourishes in the 18th and 19th century. Today, we take for granted the process of setting content into publications with consistent, reliable results. But as Hyman's studies of the effects and results of various compositors on the first folio of Shakespeare's work in 1623 demonstrates, typesetting fonts and even typographers are the individual compositors of the first folio had a grave relationship to the published work and actually changed the written work for generations to come. The centuries that precede the Industrial Revolution was a golden age of creating type. The various styles and proportions that we still use in typography design were established and refined during those decades. Serif, slab, script, sans serif, and display typography design face came out of this tradition, and the measurement of type in points and ems became the norm from this time. These traditional fonts became the basis for font foundries in the Industrial Revolution, and typefaces and conventions were quickly incorporated and commercialized by large corporations like Linotype and Agfa as revenue streams to augment their product lines. Until the Industrial Revolution, both the font foundry and printing industry were centered geographically in commercial cities within Western countries, and each had distinct styles. Beginning with the early creation of Grandjean and Garriman, a rich heritage of classical proportion fonts was established and extended by type designers. These fonts included Baskerville, Bodoni, Helvetica, and many more that are still in use today. The personal computer, along with the release of the Apple LaserWriter, Altus PageMaker, the Linotype Image Setter, and Adobe PostScript, revolutionized both type and printing by changing the access of the individual or small firm to the means of production. However, during the formative years of 1985 to 1999, Adobe managed to capture the emerging font market by being device independent, which allowed them to form alliances with corporations like Linotype, Agfa, and Apple. Apple's adaptation of PostScript in its original LaserWriter changed printing and typography forever. Despite the fact that this machine was limited to only 13 fonts, 4 variations of Times, Helvetica, Courier, and 1 variation of Symbol, it changed the typesetting and printing industry virtually overnight. Adobe quickly cemented its lead in typography font delivery through licenses for traditional font faces with the Industrial Revolution giant Linotype and Monotype, while refashioning standards like Garriman into Adobe Garriman and employing talented type designers like Carol Trombley, who created new interpretations of classic styles and new modern classic typefaces such as Adobe Caslon, Chaparral, Charlemagne, Lithos, Myriad, Nuevo, Trajan, and Viva. However, Adobe did not make headway into the operating system fonts of either computer giant until Windows 2000, when Adobe and Microsoft introduced OpenType technology that merged the best of PostScript and TrueType and incorporated Unicode and opened up the world for both of them. Word had integrated with HTML since the early 1990s, giving even the novice access to HTML editing. Although common wisdom holds that sans serif fonts are easier on the eyes in digital format, while serifs are easier to read in printed media, the widespread use of Arial on websites and social applications has eroded the general acceptance of this maxim. The availability of Unicode in both Times Roman and Arial have only increased the dominance of these two fonts throughout the world within the non-design environment. But due to the limitation of web fonts that work on all computers in CS Level 1 and HTML 4.0, Arial, Times, Verdana, and Georgia became the de facto fonts of Web 1.0. The reliance on pixel screen technologies has made sans serif fonts easier to read on the web because of the linearity of those fonts rendered better as a whole pixels in the smaller font sizes on device screens. However, the widespread use of Arial as the web font of choice is determined more by character count than aesthetic preference. Arial, due to its superior character count, allows more characters in much smaller places like menu bars, which are essential to web navigation. With the adaptation of Web 2.0, the dominance of Arial prevails. Google, Facebook, and Twitter are just several social media fonts that use Arial in their applications, which are viewed throughout the world. This prevalence of Arial has influenced how we perceive sans serif fonts. In fact, I recently polled a class of university design students, and they were convinced that sans serif fonts are the easiest to read, not just on the web, but even in print books. This trend towards the sans serif font has shifted into print with designers and clients also. I also recently worked on a printed report that was done entirely in multiple sans serif fonts over design choices that included serif fonts. When I first started working in print in the early 1990s, the rule of thumb was to choose two fonts, one serif and one sans serif in a publication, and in a longer document, perhaps add a display font or a caption font. Adobe echoed this wisdom in its development of pro display fonts or caption fonts. Adobe includes these fonts within their pro fonts. In the early 1980s and early 1990s, there was a danger of amateur designers or do-it-yourselfers to use what is commonly called ransom note typography, or the use of many fonts that truly clash with each other. However, it appears that this trend has been replaced with a preference towards the sans serif font for everything. This is another example of the bidirectional practice of web moving back into the mainstream practice of the older print medium. It's instructive to look at the digital publishing practices of moving magazines into mobile and e-reader device delivery and contrast it to the practice of creating content for e-books on the same devices. Magazine layout has always been basically a layout that focuses on the design unit of the spread or two-facing pages within the magazine publication, where content and image are very closely related together and interact and fit with each other. Even today, magazine layout is still essentially entirely done in layout programs like InDesign and Quark, and when the printed layout is transferred to what Adobe is calling the Digital Publishing Suite, the layout is tweaked into various different fixed page sizes, and then each page of these new versions is reproduced as a whole image through the format of either JPEGs or PDFs. This similarity to the earlier book form is reflected in the fact that you save these various repositioned pages as folios in the Adobe Digital Publishing Suite. Ebooks, however, are very different because the basic book is formatted in sections and depend on the flowing of content into chapters. This action is not strongly related to page count. Instead, characters are counted and blank or filler pages are added to signatures to accommodate the total content and page count of the book. In other words, the format of books as ebooks can adjust to a liquid page that reflects the screen size of the device and are styled and formatted around the chapter and section head hierarchy of the content, which is used to create the table of content. The only suggested need for a page break in an ebook is prior to a new chapter or part. The table of content in an ebook is a series of hyperlinks to the heads within the content and do not rely upon a physical page. Typography plays little importance in the composition of these books and is usually supplied on the device through a list of available and licensed fonts. The genius of Adobe is that it managed to insert its products through the licensing of traditional new font designs into the advancement of the personal computer. As the adaptation of the computer transformed the design and printing industry, Adobe managed to gain licenses to the vast type styles of monotype and linotype, bringing the heritage and the conventions of older typefaces into the emerging new media. Almost instantly, the wealth of display types and revered fonts became part of the new media of computer typesetting and survived all the changes that were to come through the new computers, while new and low-cost fonts are produced through the availability of new programs like Freehand and Illustrator that are owned or bought by the Contenso new supplier of type, Adobe. Since CS2, it's been possible to specify and provide fonts on websites. However, like so much currently on the web, support is not consistent across browsers, and Internet Explorer does not support the same format as other browsers. Most modern browsers support TrueType and OpenType, but although Microsoft developed this type technologies, Internet Explorer only supports a .eot format, which stands for Embedded Open Type Format. To do this, one must translate the fonts using an online service such as the one found at fontsquirrel.com. In addition, many fonts that reside on the personal computer are subject to copyright laws and not allowed to be uploaded to the sites. Sensing a void within the delivery system of computer services, Google has actually created a free project of web fonts that are easy to use in web programs. One of the most popular Google fonts is Droid Sans, which is the font family that the Droid uses in its application. The lure of the larger penetration into the global market continues to rapidly change the product lines of computer products. In addition, mobile phones and tablets sell small apps at small prices that are programmed in such a way through object-oriented programs like C++ or Java, and fonts are easily packaged within these applications. These new models have actually been a sea change for all the large players within the computer industry. As this market expands and the more traditional market of the computer diminishes, Apple and Microsoft find themselves pitted against Google for delivery of software, operating systems, and devices. Some companies like RIM and Nokia have already faltered in this rapidly changing market. One segment of the market that is expanding into a battlefield is mobile development of operating systems and hardware. Despite the fact that the sales of Windows 8 and the Surface tablet have been disappointing, Microsoft just acquired Nokia so they could increase its revenue shares to include more than software licensing on the sale of phones. Each major mobile OS uses a sans serif font in its operating system, but they are all slightly different. Apple uses Helvetica Neue, Android Droid Sans, and Windows 7 has designed a new font called Segoy UI. 2 years ago, prototyping tools existed for just the Apple and Android markets. Now the interface includes many more companies and hardware variations. Awards.com has listed the following free fonts from Google Fonts and FontSquirrel, which are free and work on all major browsers: Open Sans, Josephine, Slab, Arvo, Lato, Vochrome, April Fatface, Ubuntu, PT Sans, PT Serif, Old Standard TT, Droid Sans, Anavirs, Junction, Vertigo, Alero, Audimat, Delicious, Procino, Photon, Photon Sans, and Chunk 5. As you can see from the example above, these fonts are varied and add a high degree of typographic detail and excellence to web presentation that has been hitherto unavailable as actual fonts on the web. In addition, Google Fonts are easy to use. They only need a link to the Google Font application and a redefinition of a CSS style or an HTML tag to add that font. However, the collection has grown to over 600 fonts, and it's hard to identify fonts in a manner similar to the fonts found in the Adobe Library of Fonts. FF Fonts has a paid subscription plan to their fonts for use on the web, as does the Adobe Creative Cloud. The paid subscription plan for the Adobe Creative Cloud is an attempt by Adobe to get back into the game. Adobe has failed to stop Apple from limiting its ban on Flash from tablets, and decline in sales of desktop and laptops has hurt Apple's sales of its products. The Creative Cloud has become accepted by most designers, and according to Adobe has 11,000 users daily signing up for the Creative Cloud. In addition, Adobe is selling reasonably priced single application of its products and tablet versions of its various programs. It's clear that Adobe is trying to generate revenue and regain dominance in novel ways in this marketplace. And one way they can do this is through its de facto acceptance as the premier font provider for publishing. The big question remains, can Adobe maintain that hold and leverage it in web delivery? Recently, Adobe has added the incorporation of web fonts from within Dreamweaver and its new Muse programs. And you see that interface in the slide above. So in conclusion, I sort of believe that Arial has meant its match. It's so 20th century, it's a thing of the past. One thing is really clear: the changes in the delivery of services and the rush to gain dominance in global markets has created a time of not only new service, but a need to distinguish brands. The software interface is one expression of these differences, and the font is part of this corporate reordering of dominance. Anyone who has used the HTML5 video tag or any of the new CSS3 transition features understands that this is a time of little standardization or cooperation between companies. Once again, the focus is on the messaging of the media, and the media is changing rapidly. It is impossible to know who will win the war of the mobile device, but it's clear that the change will include changes in the use of fonts and how they are delivered on devices.